I live on an isolated farm in the countryside, one of those in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of cornfields. I inherited the property from my father a few years ago, and since then, it's just been me and the fieldwork. I enjoy the solitude. I've always thought that the countryside offers a peace you can't find in the city, or at least I used to think so. It all started subtly. One night, after an exhausting day of work, I was sitting on the front porch, enjoying the silence when something caught my attention. Between the rows of corn, about 100 meters away, I saw something moving. I couldn't see it clearly, just a shadow, something large. At the time, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or some other creature. I grabbed my flashlight and went over to check it out, but found nothing. I went back to the house, feeling a bit silly for worrying about it. But then, the next night, it happened again. This time, the shadow was closer, more defined. I couldn't make out what it was, but it was clear that it wasn't just any animal. The figure seemed to be watching me, standing among the corn stalks. When the beam from my flashlight hit it, it simply vanished. I went to check again, but, once more, found nothing. In the days that followed, this shadow became more frequent. Some nights, I saw it moving quickly through the fields. Other times, it just stood there, watching, as if studying my movements. I began to lose sleep, growing anxious at night, always with the feeling of being watched. No matter how much I tried to convince myself it was nothing, something inside me told me that something was very wrong. Then, on a colder night, I heard footsteps for the first time. I was lying down, trying to fall asleep, when I heard the sound of heavy footsteps coming from the porch. I jumped up and went to the front door. I opened it just a crack and could hear it more clearly. Slow footsteps, pacing back and forth on the porch. That froze me. The idea that something was out there, so close, made me break out in a cold sweat. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle. When I opened the door and shined the light toward the field, the shadow was there, standing in the middle of the cornfield. This time I saw it more clearly. It was tall with a humanoid shape, but its outline was wrong, distorted. Its skin was pale, almost glowing under the flashlight's beam. I can't explain it, but the feeling I had was pure terror. That thing wasn't human. I tried to move, but fear paralyzed me for a few seconds. When I finally managed to take a step, I stumbled and fell to my knees. The shadow didn't move, it just stood there, watching me. I quickly got up and ran back into the house, locking the door behind me. I stayed there, rifle in hand, waiting for whatever it was to break in, but it didn't. Instead, for hours, I could hear footsteps around the house, as if it were circling, waiting for the right moment. The night dragged on, and I sat there, in the dark, listening to it pace back and forth, too afraid to go outside. When the sun finally began to rise, the sound of the footsteps stopped. I waited a while longer until I was sure it was safe, and then went out to investigate. On the ground near the porch, I saw huge footprints, marks from something I had never seen before. The tracks led from the cornfield to the porch and back, as if that thing had really been lurking around all night. After that, I couldn't stay there at night anymore. Each sunset brought back that memory of what I saw. I didn't call anyone, didn't tell anyone, because who would believe it? A grown man, a farmer, afraid of a shadow in the middle of a cornfield? But I knew what I saw. I felt that presence, that thing watching me. That was the last night I spent there alone. I packed my things and left the next day. I sold the farm some time later, but I always hear stories that anyone who passes by at night still sees something moving among the corn stalks. And honestly, I don't doubt it. Last summer, I went to spend a few days at my grandparents' farm. They live in a rural area, far from everything, and since I've always enjoyed spending my vacations there, I figured it would be another peaceful time, just like always. I was wrong. On the first day, while helping my grandfather in the field, I noticed a strange scarecrow in the middle of the wheat field. It was quite old, dirty, with torn clothes and a straw hat. The usual stuff, you know? But there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. Its eyes were made of buttons, and the way they were sewn on gave me an eerie feeling, like it was always watching me. I mentioned it to my grandfather, who laughed and said that scarecrow had been there since before I was born and had never caused any trouble. The first night, I slept without any problems, but on the second day, I started to notice something bizarre. I was on the porch watching the field at dusk, and I swear the scarecrow seemed closer than it had been the day before. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe I was tired or seeing things. After all, everything looks the same after a while in the fields. But it stuck in my mind. On the third day, I decided to prove it. I went out with my phone and took a picture of the scarecrow in the afternoon. That night, before going to bed, I went back to the porch for one last look at the field, and to my shock, the scarecrow was definitely closer to the house. The distance between it and the porch had shrunk. I checked the photo on my phone, and the spot where it had been earlier was clearly different from where it was now. The scarecrow had moved. I went back inside, uneasy, but tried not to think too much about it. It was hard to believe what I was seeing. Who would move a scarecrow in the middle of the night? My grandparents were already asleep, and I started to feel paranoid. I decided not to mention it to them. However, the next night, everything changed. I was lying in bed when I heard a sound outside my bedroom window. Something was scratching the outside wall of the house. A dry, rhythmic sound. My room faced the field, and the noise seemed to be coming from there. With my heart racing, I got up and went to the window. At first, I hesitated to open the curtains, but curiosity got the better of fear. When I opened the window, I saw the scarecrow. It was there, right in the middle of the field, but much closer to the house now. It was as if, each night, it moved a few meters closer to me. I stood frozen. It was still motionless, with those dark button eyes staring straight at me, but it was impossible to deny it was getting closer. The next day, the scarecrow was back in its usual place. There were no footprints on the ground, nothing to suggest it had moved, but I knew what I had seen. Now I was scared, and the following nights became a nightmare. Each night, the scarecrow seemed to inch closer. I could swear its arms were becoming a little looser, as if they were about to move. One day, I woke up in the middle of the night with the sensation that something was watching me. When I looked out the window, there it was, just a few meters from the porch. That's when I realized it was moving toward me. There was no other explanation. That same night, I ran to my grandparents' room and woke them up, telling them everything that had been happening. They were confused, saying I must be dreaming, but I insisted. I begged them to come out to the porch with me and look. And to my surprise and horror, the scarecrow wasn't there. It had vanished. My grandfather tried to calm me down, saying it must have been some animal messing with the structure or maybe some sort of prank by local kids. But I knew that wasn't normal. On the last night before heading back home, I woke up again to the sound of scratching on the wall. But this time it was different. When I looked outside, I didn't see the scarecrow in the field. It was standing in the middle of the lawn, just a few meters from my window. I left the next morning and never went back. My grandparents say everything is still normal over there, but I don't believe it. I know what I saw. I don't have an explanation, but I know that scarecrow wasn't just a lifeless figure in the field. I'm a farm worker, and a few months ago, I was hired to help with the harvest on a large soybean farm. I've worked on many farms before, but this was the first time I genuinely felt afraid to be in the fields. And to this day, I can't explain what happened there. The farm was in a remote area like many others, but the atmosphere was much more isolated. There was only a small dirt road cutting through miles of soybean fields. I was greeted by the owner, Mr. Elias, a quiet man with that serious, experienced farmer's look. He gave me basic instructions, and since the harvest had already started, he assigned me to one of the tractors to work until nightfall. Everything seemed normal on the first day, but soon things started to change. On my second night there, after a hard day in the field, I was resting at the bunkhouse. The other workers had already gone to bed, and I stayed outside, enjoying the cool breeze. That's when I heard the voices for the first time. It sounded like murmuring coming from the soybean fields, as if several people were talking at once, but I couldn't make out a single word. I thought it was just the wind passing through the leaves, but the way the voices echoed sent a chill down my spine. I tried to ignore it, but later that same night, I woke up to an even clearer sound. Voices whispering my name. Carl. It was as if someone was calling me. I got out of bed, confused, trying to figure out where it was coming from. I'm not easily scared, but there was something unsettling about those voices. I went to the window of the bunkhouse and looked out at the fields. I didn't see anyone, but the voices continued, as if they were moving through the soybeans, getting closer and closer. The next morning, I told one of the other workers about what I had heard. He gave a short laugh and said that people in the area had heard similar stories, but it was all just superstition. Those voices come and go, but no one ever sees anything, he said. That made me suspicious, but I decided to keep working. I needed the money. However, the following night, things got much worse. It was late, and I was coming back from the field after checking the machines. As I passed near the plantation, I heard it again. But this time, the voices were louder and clearer. They seemed to be surrounding the field. I could hear my name being repeated, now with a more urgent tone, as if they wanted to lure me in. But there was no one there. Couldn't be the wind. I stopped, trying to listen more closely, and the sound grew more intense. Not only that, but the rows of soybeans started moving, as if something was walking between them. I turned on my flashlight and pointed it toward the noise, but saw nothing. Just the plants shaking, as if something invisible was rustling them. I returned to the bunkhouse, but I couldn't sleep. I knew something was wrong with that place. The next morning, I decided to talk to Mr. Elias, but he simply brushed me off, like it was some kind of madness on my part. I didn't push it, but the feeling that something was watching me never left. I started noticing that each night, the voices were getting closer, clearer. They called me into the field. It felt like an invitation, but with a threatening undertone, as if I knew that if I followed those voices, I wouldn't come back. Then the last night came. I was getting ready to leave the farm, already decided to quit, when the voices returned, louder than ever. This time, they weren't just whispering. They were shouting my name. Carl, Carl. It was as if they were desperate for me to come to them. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the voices. Couldn't resist. The soybean plants moved as if something was running through them, circling me. My heart was racing, and my flashlight shook in my hand. In the middle of the field, I saw something that made me stop. It was a circular clearing, as if the plants had been ripped out to form an empty space. In the center were strange symbols drawn on the ground, like someone had performed a ritual there. And at that moment, I realized the voices weren't coming from anything human. They weren't echoes of lost people. They were something darker, something that wanted to drag me into that circle. I don't know how I found the strength to run, but I did. I ran as fast as I could back to the bunkhouse, grabbed my things, and left without looking back. I never returned to that farm. I don't know what those voices were or what the symbols in the field meant, but since that night, they still echo in my head, calling me